Hey guys, it's Greg with JHDrums.com. Welcome back to another drum mixing tutorial. In today's video, we're going to wrap up our snare processing, and we're going to do that by adding a reverb, because every good snare needs a nice reverb. And we're going to do this. We're going to go to our insert channel here. We're going to navigate down to reverb. We're going to go to no. See, that's not what we want to do. That is the whole purpose of me making this video. Never add a reverb to your insert channel on your source channel strip. In this case, the snare bus. If you're using just a single mic, it would be your snare top mic. When you add it to the insert channel in that fashion, you have limited control over the verb, and you're going to have to adjust your dry signal versus your wet signal, and you're not going to be able to shape the reverb the way that we can in the method that I'm about to show you. So this is what I recommend you do on any source if you're going to add reverb. We are going to go within our channel strip, and instead of going into the insert channel, we're going to go to a send. Just like we created our buses, or the same way that we created our buses for snare top and bottom, we created a snare bus. For overhead left and right, we created our bus. We did that via our in and out section. But we're going to do this on the sends. So we're going to left click on one of our send tracks, or send sections. We're going to go to bus, and we're going to select, any bus is fine. I'm going to do this in ascending order. So bus 3 will be fine in this case. And you'll see just as before, it's created an auxiliary track, or an auxiliary channel strip. And what this does is it allows us to use this entire channel strip only for reverb. So what we'll do, in Logic, you have a control of the amount of the send. So basically almost a secondary fader of how much of the signal from the snare bus or the snare top that you want to send to this auxiliary track. What I like to do is just hold Alt and click and send it, completely at 0 dB or unity gain. So we're sending the entire signal to our auxiliary channel strip. And this is where we want to add a reverb. And this auxiliary track, which we'll name snare verb, because we're real creative. And this insert is where our reverb is going to live. So let's go into the insert channel, navigate down to reverb, and we're going to go to Space Designer. Space Designer was a more current version of a reverb plugin that was added in the more recent Logic versions, and I think it's just a fantastic reverb plugin. So that's typically what I'll use for any reverb. But of course, if you have a different DAW, any type of reverb will work. Of course, that's completely, your own taste, so that's fine. But we do want to make sure that it's a mono reverb. So we'll select mono. And what I want to do is I'm going to grab a preset. I'm going to go to, let's say, medium spaces. And for me, I like plate reverbs on the snare. They just tend to have a more realistic room sound that accentuates the fullness of the snare drum, gives it some more body. So I'm going to select a plate reverb. In this case, I don't want it to be super long, because it is this particular drum performance, there's a lot of hits in succession. So I'm going to use a relatively fast plate. And this is a 1.3 second soft plate. Within our parameters here on the main screen of our Space Designer plugin, I want to make sure that the reverb is maxed out. So 100% wet, 0 dry, and I'm going to uncheck this reverb volume compensation. What this does is it pays attention to the velocity of the transient of the snare. So if it's hit softer, it's not going to add as much reverb. If it's hit harder, obviously there'll be more reverb. I typically uncheck that because I want the reverb to be constant. Now that's just really, a preference of mine. You don't necessarily have to disengage that if you don't want, but that's what I recommend doing. And check this out. Just by soloing our snare verb now, we can preview. I'm going to bring this down because it's going to be quite a lot of reverb. We could preview just the reverb that's being sent from, or almost keyed, if you will, from our snare. So take a listen. So we have complete control over our verb. We don't have to worry about, wet and dry. We don't have to worry about, any other parameter within our reverb plugin. And it's not going to affect our initial source. It's completely separate. So that's why I recommend doing this via an auxiliary send. This is bugging me, so I'm going to go ahead and do what we did previously. I'm going to color code, of course, to our track. Our snare bus was orange. I'm going to make it a darker orange, just kind of offset it. I'm going to create a arrange version, or allow this to show up in the arrange window. And I'll just click and drag our snare verb channel strip to sit right underneath our snare bus. So now when we go back to mixer, it's of course right next to our snare top, bottom, and bus. So helps me out, makes things a little bit more visually correct. Anyways, so now that we've done this, I want to point out, and this is something that I've kind of stumbled upon and no one has really ever mentioned, but everybody talks about, high pass filtering and EQing out the sub bass frequencies on the instruments that we have, like our snare or our overheads or our toms, but they never talk about an EQ on a reverb. And it just makes sense to me that if I'm adding a high pass to my snare up to the 130 hertz range, why am I not doing this with my EQ? So in Logic, you can do this right in the Space Designer plugin. They have an EQ section, and they've got this, it's not necessarily a low pass, but it is a shelf that we can add. And I am going to just do this visually. I'm not necessarily looking at the numbers. Where this is a shelf, I just want to make sure that, right around the 150 range, right there between 100 200 hertz, this section, I want to get rid of all that sub bass within our reverb. Now remember, this is just the reverb. We're affecting only the reverb, and it's a way to clean up that sub bass frequency that's not even in our snare track, and to remove it from our Reverb Send. You could do it this way, or if you aren't using Logic, but you are using a send to add your reverb, you could just go into your insert channel on your snare verb channel strip and add an EQ. Just like we did with any other instrument. Bring up an EQ after your verb and add a high pass. Simple as that. Do this and it'll clean up the unnecessary low-end verb that doesn't need to be there. Get rid of that sub-bass frequency and clean up your reverb to provide more headroom in your mix. So, of course, our Space Designer plugin's taking care of that, so I'm going to remove that EQ from our channel strip. But let's go ahead and preview the snare top and bottom via our snare bus and the verb, and see how we can blend this to taste. What's nice is we have a fader that's, entirely responsible for our verb. So instead of having to do this within the plugin that we use, we have a whole channel strip allotted for reverb fine tuning. The way I like to approach reverb is basically bring our fader down or our mix down so that the reverb is sent, to where you can almost not hear it. It's there. You can hear it in the background, but it's almost as if it's not there. I know that's kind of contradictory, but the reason for that is, after you, towards the end of your mix, if you're going to add compression to the entire drum bus, if you're sending it off for mastering, or even if you're mastering yourself, there's going to be compression, limiting, and all these things tend to bring out the subtleties of a mix. And if we keep our reverb conservative and tuck it underneath just enough to where we can just barely hear it, in the end, it's going to come out as the final result, the final mix, and or the final master, and not be overwhelming. So that's why I like to bring it down to that level. So let's go ahead and do that. I mean, that sounds cool, but that's way too much for her. And let's preview this in the whole mix here. Cool. See how you can hear that tail? When that was playing, you couldn't hear that tail of the reverb. But that's why I like to bring it down to this level. And it's there, it's adding to the snare, but it doesn't need to be, you don't want to add too much, because that's where you get into headroom problems and you end up muddying up the mix in that fashion. So let's preview it without. I'll go ahead and mute it, and then we will add it, and we could tell the difference in perspective of the entire mix. So this is without. Very dry. And let's add it in. Let's go back to that same section. I'll play it dry about halfway through and then engage it. Engage. And you could tell it just, it adds body, it adds space, and it just makes our snare drum sound that much better. So that's the take home, guys. Add reverb via an auxiliary send and control it entirely via a single channel strip. Also, add an EQ to your snare, either within the parameters of the plugin, or if you don't have that, add it to the channel strip. Since you've created that auxiliary channel strip, you have complete control of just the verb. And in that fashion, you'll have a better sounding reverb on your snare, and it will sit better. It'll provide more headroom, and in the end, just make for a much better sounding snare in your mix. So implement this, guys, and make better drum mixes. That's going to be the final part to our snare processing. In the next video, we will get into kick drum. Again, we are going to look at similar plugins. Just as we did with the snare, we're going to look at EQ, compression, gating, things like that. So be sure to stay tuned. And if you have any questions, if you run into problems within your, if you're not using Logic, or if you're in another DAW and you want to implement this, feel free to, leave your questions below in the comments. I am happy to assist you in any way I can. If you're enjoying the series, enjoying the tutorial videos, guys, be sure to subscribe, give us a like if you dig it, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video, guys. Thanks so much for your time. We'll see you soon.